And today we will speak about schizophrenia, and which is my favorite subject ever. And Anna is the right person to present it for you. And let's start.
So tell me if you see my screen. Okay, wait. Okay. Okay. Can you see it, Matteo?
Yes, we can see it.
So today we're gonna, as Lorenzo was saying, we're gonna discuss about schizophrenia and how schizophrenia is much more than hallucinations. And specifically, we are gonna focus on the pathophysiology of this disorder and in talking more precisely on the role of the tryptophan and kynurenine pathway, which is actually part of my thesis project. So first of all, I want to ask you some questions. So what do you think is the prevalence of schizophrenia worldwide? So the percentage of people affected by schizophrenia in the world. I don't see someone is raising their hands, so just open your microphone and...
1 in 1,000.
No.
1%.
Exactly. I don't know who said it, but it is actually right. 1%.
Take credit. Who said it? Take credit.
Said it.
Mihai, it's Emerson.
Hi, Emerson. So Emerson is actually right. So 1% of the population worldwide is affected by schizophrenia. And do you know which is the age of onset of this disorder? So, Pietro?
Slightly younger for females, like around 18 mean, and for males 22, 23.
Yes, so in a broader range is between the age of 20 and the age of 30. So actually, we are in the middle of the age in which schizophrenia actually develops. So as you can see from the slide, schizophrenia is the seventh disease in the worldwide for the years lost due to disability, and it costs to healthcare system a lot of money. As you can see, in Italy is 3.2 billions of euros. And what do you think is the major cause of death in patients affected by schizophrenia? It's very counterintuitive, actually. So it is the most difficult question. Matteo is right. So actually, the leading cause of death in patients affected by schizophrenia are cardiovascular diseases, and we will discover why later. But practically speaking, what is schizophrenia? Like, my question is, how do you imagine a patient affected by schizophrenia? Like, when I say schizophrenia, or what comes to your mind?
Like hallucination.
Exactly. But actually, schizophrenia is much more. The term of schizophrenia means actually a completely broken, fractured mind, because basically what happens in the mind of this patient is that there is a complete disorganization of the psychic function comprising affectivity, so they have problem facing emotion, will, as well as cognition, which is a major concern of this patient. Correctly, as someone of you said, hallucinations are a major pattern of this disorder. So here you can find one of the points of the diagnosis of the DSM-5. But speaking practically, no psychiatrist actually uses the DSM-5, and Lorenzo can confirm this. But I put it just right here for you to make you understand what is the leading symptomatology of this disorder. So first of all, we have delusion and hallucination, which are what people outside of the psychiatry world mainly think about patients affected by schizophrenia. But then we have also disorganized speech. So often when you hear this patient talking, their speech doesn't make much sense, or even if at the beginning it makes sense, then they get lost in the way while they're talking. Another major problem is a gross disorganized behavior, which means that they often react wrongly to even normal situation, and they cannot properly face normal life challenges. And a real core of the symptomatology are the negative symptoms. which often are not seen, but actually they are a major point of this disorder. What I want you to leave is that, however, to make a diagnosis of schizophrenia, you need either delusions or hallucination. Without the presence of those, you cannot make the proper diagnosis. So first of all, we are gonna focus on the positive dimension, which are the hallucination. Most of the patients have actually auditory hallucination above the 70%. So basically what happened, they hear voices, like third-party voices outside their head. A minority of patients have visual hallucination, which are mostly like shades, not often clear-cut visual hallucination, and very rarely of olfactive ones, but honestly, it happened just once to me to encounter a patient with olfactive hallucination. They're extremely rare. Then we have pseudo hallucination, which are a little more subtle. So the voices, instead of being from third parties, are inside the patient's head. So here below in the slide, you can read a sentence that actually one of the patients I saw in Villeturo actually said to me, "Doctor, I don't know anymore what means thinking by myself." Do you think this sentence enters in an hallucination or a pseudo hallucination?
Pseudo hallucination.
Exactly, I think it was Emerson again. Tell me if I'm wrong because I don't see the Teams page. Anyway, exactly, it was
Me and someone else.
okay. So it is actually a pseudo hallucination. This patient basically had two rappers inside his head. They were commenting his thoughts. So he said, "I don't know anymore what means thinking by myself," which is on one side extremely sad. And then we have another major part of the positive dimension, which are delusions. So basically, patients make wrong inference about reality, which means that basically they interpret wrongly real life events. So, for instance, they see somebody talking in the same room and they think, "Oh, they are gonna talk, they are talking about myself, or maybe they are planning to kill me," something like that. In many cases, in patients with schizophrenia, delusions are paranoid. So it really makes the patient's life extremely difficult. Then we have the disorganized dimension, which is also another major problem of this patient. And we have different types of disorganization. The two most common ones are the thinking disorganization and the behavioral one. With the thinking disorganization, we mean what is written here in Italian is the concretizzazione del pensiero, which means they think everything in a very concrete way. So they are not able to understand the subjectivity of a speech. So, for instance, if you ask to a patient with schizophrenia, what does it mean? It's raining cats and dogs. What do you think they are going to answer to you?
That it's raining cats and dogs.
Exactly. They think that they're actually cats and dogs that are falling from the sky. They're not able to tell you that it's raining cats and dogs means that it's simply raining a lot. They completely lose this capability. And instead, the behavioral disorganization is basically what we were saying previously, that these patients generally are not able to comprehend and react properly even to simple life events. And then we have the negative dimension, which is a major concern that, as I said previously, is often not seen in this patient. So they suffer of apathy, which means the complete loss of any type of feeling. Then they have abulia, which is instead the loss of alogia is actually the loss of connection. Then we have anedonia, which is complete loss of any type of interest. But these symptoms can be either primary or secondary. Primary means that basically they are the core of the disease. So often these patients develop the negative symptomatology sooner than the positive one. So you won't see hallucination, but they already are apathic, they don't have any interest, or they can be secondary to the positive symptomatology. Because, for instance, if you're thinking that people outside your house are actually talking about killing you, you really don't want to go out. So at the end, the outcome is the social retirement, and often these patients don't go out of their houses, they become completely disconnected from society, and a major work of the psychiatric world is try to reinsert this patient into society because they are completely detached. For instance, what also these patients say is that everything else was just kept peaking and peaking, hacking away, and nothing was interesting. That's a major concern of this patient. They are in a way completely lost and disconnected from reality due to this negative dimension. And then we have the cognitive impairment. Cognitive impairment is not actually one of the core symptoms of the patient affected by schizophrenia, but is a major problem. Many studies have reported that since schizophrenia is a chronic disorder, progressively as the years of disease pass, these patients have a decrease in their intellective quotient, which means they basically lose vocabulary, they lose the capability of comprehension, they lose the verbal fluency and semantic fluency. But on the counterpart, we have also many studies that report that a low intellective quotient, so early cognitive impairment, is one of the leading causes of schizophrenia. So a major problem in schizophrenia is to understand what came first, the egg or the chicken. So is the cognitive impairment leading to schizophrenia, or is schizophrenia that is leading to cognitive impairment? It's very difficult to determine. Probably both things are true, but this discussion, is beyond this presentation. So then we are going to focus on the pathophysiology of this disorder. Firstly, about the etiology. As all psychiatric condition, also schizophrenia is a multifactorial disorder. But what I want you to remember is that among the psychiatric condition, schizophrenia is the one that is mostly determined by genetics. For instance, if you have a relative, a first-degree relative that is affected by schizophrenia, you have a risk of developing schizophrenia of the 80%. Which is very high, is higher, for instance, than type 2 diabetes. But going back to pathophysiology, we have obviously the role of neurotransmitters, and the major one are dopamine, glutamate, serotonin, and then the tryptophan and the kynurenine pathway. So for those of you who have already studied psychiatry, you know the dopaminergic and hypodopaminergic hypothesis. So dopamine plays a relevant role in various brain pathways. So we have the mesocortical pathway that goes from the ventral tegmented area through the hippocampus and then to the prefrontal cortex. And what happens here, there is an inhibition at the level of the ventral tegmented area that blocks its dopaminergic activity. So it's a pathway that becomes hypodopaminergic and leads to the development of the negative symptoms. On the counterpart, we have another pathway, which is instead the mesolimbic one, that goes again from the ventral tegmented area, but in this case through the limbic system, so to the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens. And in this case, instead, there is an hyperdopaminergic activity that is the one that leads to the positive symptomatology, so to the hallucinations, the delusions. And then we have a third pathway that is the least studied at the moment, which is the temporolimbic one. That is the one that instead controls predominantly the cognitive part of the schizophrenic patient. But a question, where do you think that antipsychotics are working? So on which one of those pathways?
The second one?
Exactly. Antipsychotics are actually working basically exclusively on the positive symptomatology. That's why these patients are much more than hallucination, because hallucinations are the only thing that, as of right now, can be easily controlled by the pharmacological treatment. So psychiatrists really do not worry about the positive symptomatology and the hallucination in general, because it's something that with an optimal antipsychotic treatment can be very well controlled. For the rest of the symptomatology, so the disorganization, the apathy, the anhedonia, the abulia, it's much more difficult. Studies are done and right now, but success is still quite low, actually. Then we have serotonin. As you may know, there are many illicit drugs as amphetamine or LSD that can actually induce psychosis, and they are hyperserotoninergic, so a high level of serotonin can induce the development of hallucination. But also studies report that apparently serotonin is also involved at some level in cognition. And was another important point, the second generation antipsychotics, which are the newest drugs used in the treatment of schizophrenia, have also, together with the antidopaminergic activity, also an anti-serotonergic activity. But then we are arriving at the tryptophan and kynurenine pathway. So as you may know, tryptophan is also an amino acid, and tryptophan can follow two different routes. One, that is the minor one, that is just 1% of the tryptophan is used for the synthesis of serotonin, while the rest, the remaining 99%, goes all in what is called the kynurenine pathway, through which there is the production of kynurenine, and then kynurenine itself can follow two different pathways, either the production of kynurenic acid, simply known as KYNA, or can go further down to the production of quin or quinolinic acid, and then the production of NAD+, that, as you may recall from biochemistry, is used in many fundamental biochemical pathways as the Krebs cycle or the oxidative phosphorylation, for instance. But where and how the tryptophan and kynurenine pathway is important. Actually, this pathway is not relevant only in psychiatry, but also in many other diseases. It is involved in inflammation, therefore it becomes important also in infections, as well in autoimmune diseases, in some neurological diseases as well as multiple sclerosis or Huntington, but as well as in cancer. What we have to focus on are the two major components of this pathway, which are the kynurenic acid, KYNA, which has actually a neuroprotective activity because it acts as a competitive antagonist for the glutamatergic and NMDA receptor and the AMPA receptors, as well on the acetylcholine receptors. Instead, the quin has a neurotoxic activity because it is an agonist of the glutamatergic receptors. So it causes the so-called glutamatergic excitotoxicity that damages the neuron extremely severely. And also it causes lipid peroxidation that causes even a more severe damage on the neurons. What is important to know is that the kynurenic acid is produced by the astrocyte at the brain level, while the quinolinic acid is produced instead by the microglia, and then they both can act at the neuronal level. But going back to schizophrenia, where this pathway is relevant. So in schizophrenia, there is a massive augmentation of the production of the kynurenic acid due to the fact that there is a decrease or complete absence activity of this enzyme, simply known as KMO, which blocks the progression toward the quinolinic acid. So all the kynurenine is basically converted in kynurenic acid. And what has been found is that the polymorphism that leads to inactivation of the KMO are actually linked at the gene level to family clusters of schizophrenia, because as we were saying previously, schizophrenia is a disorder that has a very strong genetic component. So there are clusters of schizophrenia in families. Quite often you can find brother, twins, all affected by schizophrenia, often because they have one of the parents that is also affected. Another major point is that there is a reciprocal relationship between the level of kynurenic acid and inflammation. So we have that when there is inflammation, there is basically the conversion of kynurenine in kynurenic acid, and then kynurenic acid itself causes the further development of the inflammation. So basically it is an endless circle that keeps going. But to understand what actually the kynurenine are doing at the schizophrenic level, so for what concerns positive symptoms, the elevation of the kynurenic acid causes a loss of the GABAergic inhibition on the ventral tegmental area, which means that there is a stimulation of the hyperdopaminergic activity of the ventral tegmental area that leads to the development of hallucinations. Then on the negative symptomatology, as you may remember, the tryptophan can either go down to the kynurenine pathway or go through toward the production of serotonin. In this case, since most of the tryptophan in schizophrenia is converted to the kynurenine, there is a drop in the synthesis of serotonin that is associated to the development of the negative symptomatology. And again, we have also the importance in cognition, because the KNA is able to work on all the various pathways that regulate cognition at the prefrontal cortex level. So they inhibit glutamate, acetylcholine, and dopamine as well. So they halt overall the cognitive processes. But as you remember at the beginning, we said that the leading cause of mortality in patients affected by schizophrenia was not suicide, but were cardiovascular diseases. This is connected to the fact that many patients that are affected by schizophrenia develop metabolic syndrome. For the common knowledge, the development of metabolic syndrome is due to two conditions mainly. The fact that due to the negative symptomatology, so the anhedonia, bulia, etc., they are not moving, they remain at home, so they are completely inactive. But also a major side effect of most antipsychotics is the development of the metabolic syndrome. Many patients gain weight, they develop then metabolic syndrome and then cardiovascular problems. But what has been discovered is that also schizophrenic patients have a predisposition to the development of metabolic syndrome, because the deficiency of the KMO enzymes that leads to the increased production of kynurenic acid is also present in diabetic patients. And therefore, my thesis will concentrate on this, on the existence of a triple relationship. So you know that metabolic syndrome is a syndrome that is associated to a pro-inflammatory state basically all over the body. As we said previously, the inflammation causes an hyperproduction of kynurenic acid. Kynurenic acid itself favors inflammation, and therefore there is the maintenance of this relationship in which the metabolic syndrome in this patient remains. As also we said, the kynurenine also plays a role in cognition and enhances, importantly, cognition, but also the metabolic syndrome, because obviously if you're always staying at home completely inactive, cognitively, you are really not developing very much. And many studies, also one in Villeturo, focus on how the physical activity works on a patient, because if you're actually making, for instance, patient affected by schizophrenia work out, you decrease the risk of the development of the metabolic syndrome. Then obviously sport is known to favor cognition, and also is extremely useful for this patient to being able to maintain social relationship, and so it's able to control somehow also the negative symptomatology. And actually this picture was taken from a movie that just came out, which is called Crazy for Football, and is based actually on a real story of the psychiatrist for Rome that organized the world soccer games for psychiatric patients. So that's it, basically. I don't know if somebody of you has some questions, if I'm not being clear. I think I was pretty fast, yes. Non so se c'è qualcuno che parla.
Beh, come al solito hai un sacco di domande, ma vediamo se qualcuno da casa.
I still haven't taken psychiatry, but my question was, what's the difference or what are the similarities between the negative symptoms and depression? And are these patients given antidepressants?
One that has not taken psychiatry is a very smart question, extremely smart. So basically, a patient affected by schizophrenia has no recall of having a disorder. So their criticism about having a psychiatric condition is zero. Like many patients will tell you, oh, I'm not psychotic, I do not have schizophrenia. I'm just as I ever was. Instead, the depressed patient knows how he was before. Like when he's sick, he will tell you, oh, I've never felt so bad in my life. They have criticism on their own condition, which is
insight, right?
Exactly, is the insight. They have a profound insight, which makes obviously treating a depressed patient much easier, because they are much more prone to take their treatments. While a psychotic patient that tells you, oh no, I'm not schizophrenic, obviously taking the treatment is not that easy.
And related to the question that Sophie asked, Since honestly I didn't remember from psychiatry that the prevalence was 1%, are patients who like have new diagnosis of depression, clinical depression, screened for schizophrenia or for, you know, psychotic symptoms or delusional symptoms?
Not really, because again, there is not a gene for schizophrenia. There
No,
are
no, screened. I mean, um, if the psychiatrist takes in the hospital a patient that I don't know, for example, tried to commit suicide for depression, will he look for symptoms of schizophrenia? Since, as you said, negative symptoms often occur before positive ones.
Well, you could have like depression with psychotic
Ex-
symptoms and you screen
exactly.
for that, but it's different.
It's
So
different.
if you have like both conditions, you're talking about schizoaffective disorder. But it's
Okay.
so if psychotic patient
Deficiency.
with a mood feature, with a strong feature.
Exactly. Plus, it all goes back to the ability to criticize and have an insight on the disorder.
Mm.
It's the major features that allow you to discriminate between the two.
You said that these patients have, in a way, more chynogenic acid, and that is an antagonist of NMDA and AMPA receptor for glutamate. Do these patients have some kind of memory impairment as these?
They do. There is in this patient a strong memory impairment, both often long term and short term. In fact, often in this patient we check the intellective quotient, which is also a predictor on how this patient will do with the disorder. Because generally patients that start with a higher QE without a memory impairment, they perform generally better. So yes, they do have memory impairment, especially further you goes in the years of disease, the worse it gets. They often die much earlier compared to the general population, around 10 years before.
Thank you.
No problem.
Has there been any attempt to model and block the, what was it, KMO enzyme?
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any attempt?
No, because the major problem in this disorder is that you don't have just this gene that is playing a role. Is much like the picture is much more complex. So it's not said that even if you can manage and work, even at, for instance, gene therapy at this level, you will prevent schizophrenia. We are focusing now on it in order to try to develop new treatment and see the possible involvement also of inflammation in the disorder. But again, so multifactorial that is extremely difficult.
The last, I mean, I did not know about the concretizzazione del pensiero. Is it a feature of all patients with schizophrenia?
Not all, but many. They completely lose the capability of understanding anything that is subjective.
Any sort of metaphoric or
Exactly.
abstract language? Or...
Exactly. Even there was one patient that he was asked, what does it mean that a lawyer is a shark? Oh, that he is a shark, like the fish. Not that he was like mean.
Wow.
Yes.
So people who are not sarcastic are...
Not really.
No.
It's very difficult because like the psychotic patient in general they seem like on a way really funny, but many people like get mistaken on it because basically they are actually living completely in a different dimension compared to ours. It's very difficult to get in touch with them.
And I mean, you said the negative symptoms get progressively worse. Do the positive symptoms get worse as well?
They can, but as I said previously, with management of the antipsychotic therapy, they are extremely well controlled. Like there are patients that, like when they reach the proper treatment, they can live forever with the treatment without having any type of hallucination or delusion, but they still maintain the negative component, which is the major problems that what prevents them to have social interaction, like generally when there is the onset of this disorder, which typically happens in people of our age, they lose complete contact with their friends. They live basically alone. If they are fortunate enough to have their family behind, it can get better, but often this does not happen.
Wow, interesting.
Question. So, what are you exactly doing for your thesis? How are you studying these pathways?
So we analyze with Sofia, that is also connected, not Pavan Sofia, but the other Sofia. So we work on the HPLC, and we analyze the serum level of this patient of the tryptophan, serotonin, the serotonin phosphate, and then the kynurenine. And we are going to see the possible relationship with the development of metabolic syndrome. In fact, we are taking all the metabolic parameter of this patient, the pressure, the circumference, weight, blah, 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 all the lipid panel, and then also how this correlates with their cognitive level. So if there is this interplays of factors due to the fact that the kynurenine pathway is strongly linked with the inflammation.
I imagine it's very difficult to control for all the other factors that come into play for metabolic syndrome, like family history of metabolic syndrome, inactivity, diet.
Yes, but the actual major problem is the antipsychotic treatment, because honestly, I would say most of these patients become obese throughout the treatment, because many of the antipsychotics, especially the second generation one, they stimulate hunger. So plus this patient conduct typically a sedentary life. So that is the major problem.
And clozapine is awful for
Clozapine, yes, but olanzapine is worse.
Also the name olanzapine kind of reminds of that.
Yeah. If you're...
Non l'abbiamo sentito.
non devi parlare più forte perché non ti sento. Ok. Kynureniko.
Infiamma il sistema immunostrumentale, no? Però i metabolici hanno un'influenza, però è solo una correlazione, ci sono delle cose.
È quello che... So basically Matteo is asking if since the kynurenine pathway has an interplay with inflammation and also metabolic syndrome is a pro-inflammatory syndrome, if it's just, okay, two things that cause inflammation, or if there is actually an interplay between the two. So an interplay exists, already has been demonstrated because the KMO gene is impaired also in diabetic patients that tend to develop the metabolic syndrome. But actually, with my thesis, we are going to try to demonstrate this. So if the correlations of the elevation of the kynurenic acid with inflammation is correlated with metabolic syndrome.
Wow, I can imagine a future where low-dose aspirin is the treatment for negative symptoms of schizophrenia.
Subito, ma per
It would be amazing. No, I'm actually surprised that, like, even though it's really important, as you say, the negative symptom part, there have been like no attempts in treating it. You know, like it's crazy.
It's extremely difficult. I mean, there are some patients that also take the antidepressants, so the SSRIs, but still. Because we can say that in schizophrenia, these problems are much more eradicated, not eradicated, are much more present and within the mind of the patient compared to the one of the depressed patient. Because in the depressed patient, generally it is just a phase. They won't be depressed for all their lives if you can cure the condition. I mean, the depressed patient can have relapse throughout their lives, but they can spend years without being depressed. While a patient with schizophrenia is always a patient with schizophrenia.
It's very different courses.
Exactly, it's completely different. I mean, from the therapeutic viewpoint, obviously, the mood disorder and depression gives you much more joy compared to a schizophrenic one. But I've seen also patients with schizophrenia that have a family, they conduct a normal life with their antipsychotic treatment, they work and they live basically normally.
And despite such a strong family association, there is still not a lot of evidence about the genetic mechanism. That's insane. I mean, type 1 diabetes, there are many polymorphisms and genes that are studied, and as you said, this is even more familiar.
There have been done actually many studies on the genes involved in schizophrenia. There is also another major trial that is being conducted now on the difference in genetics between the patient treated with normal antipsychotics and those treated instead with clozapine, because as you may know, clozapine basically is the last end point of the treatment. So if no antipsychotic works, then you go on clozapine. So generally a patient that is affected by clozapine has a much more severe disease compared to one that does not need clozapine. So they're trying to see what are the genetic differences, but it's a super long study. It's a 6-year long study that started just 3 years ago, but it's a genomic study.
What they keep finding is HLA genes.
HLA, yes.
So
HLA, and there is a lot also of the methylation that works. So there is also a major role of the epigenetics that is extremely relevant. So, but I didn't put in the presentation because otherwise it would be too long.
Yes. Wow, very interesting. Thank you.
Una domanda, Emerson.
Yes, so it may be a little bit far-fetched as a reasoning, but do you have any idea if there is a link between schizophrenia and some neurodevelopmental disorders like autism spectrum disease?
There is definitely a link. Like many patients that have especially impairment at the intellectual level, they have a risk of becoming psychotic. Maybe they do not meet the exact criteria for schizophrenia, because you, beside the one that I showed you, you need to have other criteria met, but they often develop psychosis, which means the development of delusion, hallucination. It's very common.
Thank you.
Actually,
Vivek has a question.
Hi, yes. So it seems like to me a lot of the, or maybe even all of the pathologies that you mentioned today can be linked to the gut microbiome. Do you think that the gut microbiome plays a role in metabolizing antipsychotics? And if so, are you also going to be analyzing the gut microbiome signature of these patients?
Actually, my thesis before was going to be on the microbiome. So on actually how the role of how the microbiome and it's linked to the central nervous system can change the level of neurotransmitters at the central nervous system level. Also for what concerns the kynurenine pathway as well. But still, a true association still has to be found. I mean, there are initial studies that show a possible linkage, but as basically everything in psychiatry, we're still very behind compared to the rest of the specialties.
Vivek, if you're interested, I'm going to do a presentation on the gut microbiome and basically the gut-brain axis in January probably. So yeah, I'm at the moment gathering information.
Okay, yeah, great. I'm looking forward to it.
I think that the problem with the microbiome that difficult to understand it, the modification of the microbiome is a bystander, is causative, but is consequences.
I don't know if you heard what Matteo said.
No, ripetilo.
No, so basically he said that it's very difficult to determine whether the changes in the microbiome are leading to the changes at the level of the central nervous system, or if are the changes at the level of the central nervous system that halt the intestinal microbiome. Which
from what we'll talk about it, but from what I've heard, vai Matte, vai pure. From what I'm reading, it's kind of both. You know, it's like as usual, it's a two-way system. And I was actually doing research on this topic with Esposti in his laboratory in the 3rd year. But a great example is IBD, where the prevalence and incidence of anxiety and depression is much higher compared to the general population. And there is a strong association with a flare-up of IBD and a flare-up of anxiety, or a flare-up of, or a relapse of depression, and vice versa. So maybe psychic events leading to a flare-up of the condition. So, you know, clearly it's microbiome is a very complicated topic because of its nature of being studied, which is very complicated and very variable. But yeah, I'm sure that some space will be found for also metabolic syndrome is strongly associated to alterations in the microbiome. So maybe that will play a role into what Anna is doing research on as well.
Yeah, I think that generally inflammation is something that in many different fields in research is going to be studied because apparently it plays a role in many disorders, but we don't know how important this role is. So also in other psychiatric conditions, because there are also many studies on the kynurenine pathway inflammation, for instance, in bipolar disorder, in which the association is much stronger. Like the studies are much more stronger compared to the one done so far in schizophrenia. So I don't know if there are other questions. Otherwise, we can close, I think.
Okay.
Okay. So thank you, guys. And
Un applauso.
grazie,
Thank
guys.
you.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Sì, ho bloccato tutto.